Hey, welcome to this little set of videos we're going to call Sean Webb Answers Joe Rogan. First, let me say I am not affiliated with or connected to Joe Rogan or his podcast or any of his work in any way. I'm simply a fan of his stuff. I love his podcast. I love his comedy. I got tickets to his upcoming show. I'm going to stop by and see if I can't meet him after the show. But here's the thing. You guys know that I'm on the team of helping you understand your mind and expand your consciousness to the point that you can gain control of your mind and thus gain control of your life and make it awesome without having to change any of the external conditions that are going on around you at the moment, and to be able to enjoy life, right? Well, there are a lot of folks on that team, and I think Joe Rogan is one of them, and I think he brings it strong with the number of guests and the number of topics that he discusses regarding expanding our awareness and expanding our mind into different modes of thinking and listening to the other side, which I think is important because we haven't had a whole lot of people saying, let's not get so divided. Let's not get so right or left or this or that or black and white. It's all shades of gray. And so I'd like to take some of that content under fair use and use it as an example to bring to your attention some of the things that you may be missing, that you may need to pay attention to. But then also, frankly speaking, there's some opportunities that he leaves some unanswered questions on his show that can be answered. And in today's episode, there's an inaccuracy or a little bit of a fuzzy gray area that can be cleared up a little bit with some science. And so we're going to talk about that. But other than that, there's a whole lot of amazing content that you need to be exposed to if you're not already being exposed to it. So that's what this whole fan podcast is all about. But I will bring the deep wisdom and answer some questions and bring you some deep science that other folks aren't able to bring you or that aren't taking the time to bring you, so as to better understand your mind and be able to take control of your mind and be able to take control of your life. So with that, I want to get into this episode of Joe Rogan. Had a guest called Johann Hari who wrote a book on depression and offered alternative theories of the catalyst of those bouts of depression, in that there are a couple of camps on this issue. One that says, well, depression is caused by a chemical imbalance. Okay, so let's just leave that there. And then the other is, well, depression may have other causes besides the chemical imbalance, and the chemical imbalance may be symptoms of the depression rather than the cause of it. And there's a lot of science in this book, Mind Hacking Happiness Volume 1, which I wrote and put out just late last year, which supports that position. So Johann Hari is somebody that I wanted to share with you. Now, there are a few clips that I wanted to use from Joe's episode on Johann that will set the tone for the science that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. So let's get into those clips right now.
That completely makes sense, that relying constantly on other people's approval and recognition and love in order for you to be satisfied and happy is not a good recipe for getting by in this life smoothly. When you were young and you were experiencing depression, as you called it, what was the root cause of it?
So in my case, it was, there were a few things going on, and this is quite difficult for me to talk about, but one of the people I got to know for Lost Connections is this amazing guy called Dr. Vincent Felitti in San Diego. And if you don't mind, I'll tell you his story first, and I'll tell you what it made me realize about myself, and actually why I was very resistant to this. So
you were very resistant to this?
Very resistant to this insight that he had.
Okay.
And really did not want to absorb it. So he actually made this discovery, and this is going to sound like I'm talking about a whole other subject, but trust me, it gets to depression. It led to an incredible breakthrough in depression. So in the mid-1980s, Dr. Felitti is doing all this research into obesity. Basically, Kaiser Permanente, a not-for-profit medical provider down in San Diego, just had a massive fucking problem with obesity, right? That it was just a hugely growing problem with obesity. And they were trying everything and nothing was working, like giving people nutritional advice, it just wasn't working, right? So they basically said to him, they gave him quite a big budget and they're like, just figure out what the hell is going on here. So he went away and he started to work with, I think it was about 350 extremely obese people, right? People who weighed more than 400 pounds. And he starts doing all sorts of different research with them. And one day he just had this kind of almost stupidly simple thought. He thought, what if they just literally stopped eating and we gave them the nutrients they need? would they just lose loads of weight and then come down to a healthy weight? So they obviously, with like massive medical supervision, they did this, right? People, they just monitor them and they stop eating and they give them loads of vitamins and everything. And it worked, right? They did, in fact, lose loads of weight. But then something happened that no one expected. There's a woman I'm going to call Susan to protect her medical confidentiality. She'd been over 400 pounds. She got down to 138 pounds. And everyone's celebrating. They think Vincent's like a miracle worker. And then one day she freaks the fuck out, starts massively, obsessively eating. And very quickly she's back to not quite where she was, but close, right? And Vincent sits with Susan and he's like, what happened? And she's like, I don't know. And he said, well, tell me about the day you cracked, right? Turned out something had happened to her that hadn't happened to her in, I think, ever, or certainly in a very long time. A man hit on her, right? When she'd been, hugely overweight, no man had hit on her. A man hit on her, and that was the trigger, right? And he's like, okay. So they talk a lot more. He's like, when was it you started to put on weight? For her, it was when she was 11. And so he's like, well, what happened when you were 11 that didn't happen when you were 10, that didn't happen when you were 12 or 15? And she said, oh, well, that's when my grandfather started raping me. And this really stuck with him. And so he starts talking to the group and he discovered 55% of the extremely overweight people in the group, 50% people in the group, had put on their weight after being sexually abused, right? Which was an extraordinary, far more than the wider population. He's like, wait, what's going on here? This is really... Susan said to him, overweight is overlooked, and that's what I wanted to be. Right? Wow. So this thing that had looked like a pathology, right? And it is a pathology in one sense. Being extremely overweight will kill you. Suddenly didn't look like a sign of madness. It was actually performing a function that we couldn't see, right? It was protecting them from sexual attention. But, this is a small group. It's a small study. So Vincent wanted to get a lot more research on this. And this is where it led to the breakthrough in depression. So he set it up with funding from the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, kind of gold-plated organization in this, in the US for this kind of research. Everyone who came to Kaiser Permanente in the next, I think it was a year, for anything, whether you broke your leg, you had migraines, you had schizophrenia, anything, got given a questionnaire. And it had two parts. Firstly, it said, did any of these 10 bad things happen to you when you were a kid, right? Could be sexual abuse, neglect, that kind of thing. And then it says, have you had any of these problems as an adult? Obesity, injecting drug use. And at the last minute, they added depression, right? By luck. So when they got the results back, the CDC were just like, what the fuck is this? For every category of childhood trauma you went through, you were radically more likely to become depressed. If you had 6 of those categories, you were 3,100% more likely to have attempted suicide as an adult. If you'd had 6 of them, you were 4,600% more likely to have become an adult injecting drug user, right?
Wow. There's some amazing science right at the end of that clip. Now, that clip was a little long. It's going to be much longer than the shorter clips we use for the rest of this episode. But one thing that I'd like to comment on, to keep in mind as we move forward, the lady who started eating again and breaking her diet regimen was taking actions in defense of her mind's self. Now, we're going to talk about the mind's self in just a few minutes, but I wanted to set that in your mind as a little flag to say, okay, we're going to talk about this in a moment. But for now, let's get to the next clip, which takes that story just a little deeper, and then we're going to get into some science.
But the reason why I stayed with this, and the reason why I kept, spent this time with Vincent in San Diego, and the reason why I kept going with all these different causes of depression and anxiety is because once you understand what's happened, you can find solutions you otherwise didn't find. So there was a second stage of Dr. Filiti's research that to me was so powerful. It's one of the reasons why I make myself talk about this now. So if you'd indicated on the form that you'd experienced one of these forms of childhood trauma, the next time you went back to your doctor, you weren't called back, but the next time you went to your doctor was told to say something to you like, hi, Joe, I see on the form you indicated that you were violently abused when you were a child. I'm really sorry that happened to you. That should never have happened. Would you like to talk about it? And quite a lot of people said, thank you, but no, I don't want to talk about that. But a lot of people did want to talk about it. On average, the conversations lasted 5 minutes. And then the doctor said, I can refer you to a therapist to talk more about this if you want. And they were monitored to see what happened. The results were kind of incredible. There was an enormous fall in depression and anxiety just from the 5-minute meeting, right? And from the, obviously people who referred to therapy saw an even bigger fall. And it seems to be, again, this bit is going beyond what Vincent said. He said, I asked him, I said, no, I think partly what happens is it's related to shame, right?
Now, from here, Johann moves into his explanation of why he thinks the 5-minute discussion and the alleviation of the pain and suffering associated with the traumatic event is connected with an alleviation of shame. And from a complex systems point of view, there is a decent argument that could be made with the science that exists that it's connected with shame. However, there is also a lower level within the complex system of our nervous system and how it works that can explain it a little better. And so I wanted to address that with you because that's what we're talking about in understanding our mind and understanding how our nervous system works, etc. From a 50,000-foot view, your nervous system is a big communications network, right? And it sends signals back and forth all the time. Now, one of the functions that we've noticed about the nervous system is that when a communication is sent, the sending party likes to have confirmation that the communication was received. And we see this in all kinds of studies, okay? First and foremost being the name it, tame it studies, where especially in regard to our pain and suffering, right? The limbic system is this system in our brain that scans for threats constantly, and it's scanning our senses, it's scanning our thoughts for potential threats to self. And when it creates a message, it sends that message, and usually in the form of a negative emotion, some kind of a feeling, some kind of a reaction, emotional reaction. It sends it to other parts of the brain so that we become aware of that emotion, become aware of that feeling, of that reaction. Well, there's this thing in the brain where the limbic system sends these signals out, and one of the places that it sends it is the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex to say, hey, what's this all about? Is that a hose over there on the ground, or is it a snake? Is that really going to be a potential threat to us that we need to address? Now, one of the things that occurs is that when the medial prefrontal cortex and the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex put an understanding to that emotion, it downregulates the emotion in real time. And they found this out in a group of studies called the name it, tame it studies, where this guy, Lieberman at UCLA, put a group of folks inside an fMRI machine, and they said, okay, we're going to show you these images of these people in emotional states. And what happens in the brain naturally is that we, because of empathy, because of connecting with people, because of mirror neurons, we start to pick up the emotional reaction connected with whatever we're seeing. And so he put a group in there and said, just look at these things, or just listen to these sounds, and we're going to watch your brain. And so they did that. They showed the images, and the people in the fMRI machine had the emotional reaction that was associated with what they were seeing and what they were hearing. And they watched the brain, and the brain stewed on the emotion. And so what he did then is he's put a second group in, and he said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you these things, and I want you to just name the emotion that you're seeing or perceiving or feeling. And so he put the second group through. He showed them the same exact images and sounds and stuff like that, and had them name the emotion in play. And what this is doing is putting a little bit of a cognition, a little bit of an understanding to the emotion that was being sent from the limbic system to the other portions of the brain. And what happened was, upon the message being sent from the right ventrolateral and the medial prefrontal cortexes all the way back to the limbic system immediately quit sending the message of the negative emotion in play. And this is what was called the name it, tame it studies, where you name an emotion, you can tame an emotion. It downregulates. I mean, it's a physiological reaction that it physically turns off the negative reaction that you're having in real time by simply naming it. Now, we took this like 50 steps further in Mind Hacking Happiness and explained how emotions work soup to nuts to where you can actually process them so quickly you can start to move into a state of nirvana, right? But basically what that function is doing is saying, okay, Mr. Limbic System, I've received your message and I'm doing something about it. And so the limbic system says, okay, we're cool. I just want to make sure you got it. Just want to make sure you got my voicemail, right? I don't know, boss is like, did you send it? Yes. Then I got it, right? He's like, oh, technology works, man. So basically, when one portion of the brain, one portion of your nervous system sends a signal and gets a signal back that say, hey, I got that, and we're going to do something about it, then that signal stops. It's an inefficient use of energy to resend messages that have already been confirmed and are being acted upon. Now, another really interesting study that really proves this out and really nails it is someone you might have heard of before, John Gottman. In his Love Labs, he found this same thing at a higher level, in that he is world famous for, if he can listen to you talk to your spouse for 15 minutes, he can nail whether or not the relationship is going to make it, like beyond 10 years or whatever, to 90% accuracy, which is crazy accurate, because if you're anything above 50%, now you're into science, because that's chance. It's like flipping a coin, right? He nailed it to 90% accuracy with listening to 15 minutes of a conversation. If he listens to an hour of your conversation, he can increase it to 95% accuracy. And he found in his work, and which is why he's world famous, that there's one magic bullet. There's one set of circumstances that when they're there, the relationship makes it. When they're not there, the relationship doesn't make it. And it's going to be very connected with this receiving the message thing that we just talked about. The magic bullet is the magic ingredient in a successful relationship. And they studied heterosexual relationships. It's a dated study, but they've followed up since, and it's accurate in all the follow-up studies. But they studied a man and a woman married, listen to their conversation for 15 minutes and an hour and that type of thing. Here's the determining factor of whether or not a relationship is going to make it or not. If the female in the relationship feels like she's been heard because she sees it in the behavior of her spouse, the marriage makes it. And if that condition isn't set, the marriage doesn't make it, or the relationship doesn't make it, period. So if the female feels that she has been heard by seeing it through the actions of her spouse, like the actual changes in behavior of her spouse, that she feels like she's being heard, the relationship makes it. And if that's not there, the relationship doesn't make it. And what that is simply an expansion of I'm sending you a signal, and I need to see that you've received it. Right? It's the same basic functionality of our nervous system en masse. Okay? And at the point that the signal has been received, or the information has been received, then it stops sending it. And it resolves. It's not like it stores it away to send it again later. It's like, okay, no, message sent. We're cool now. Okay? And that, I believe, is the real reason of what we're talking about with the 5 minutes of discussion with the patient of the doctor who talks about the traumatic event. The message is sent, the doctor receives it, right? The counselor receives it, the therapist receives it, they talk about it, boom, it gets resolved. And it doesn't get sent again, and it alleviates the trauma of the repressed shit. That's what's really going on there. And of course, it can, in a complex system, patterns of activity occur at multiple levels. It can be brought up 3 or 4 levels and connected with shame, right? Because shame is a much more complex process than what we're talking about here. But if you can explain something at a much lower level in a complex system, usually, well, if not all the time, it is caused by that lower level function. So rather than having it be shame, really it's a function of how the nervous system is working en masse, in that when the message is received and understood, it's not sent anymore, and it's resolved, and you're on with your life. You're on to the next bigger, better thing, right? So that's what we're talking about in actuality of what's going on in the mind of the person that's discussing their traumatic event. So if you've got traumatic events in your past life, address those, talk about them. You got to get into a counseling situation, or you got to address those. You can even address them without talking to anybody, by talking about it with yourself, by understanding your mind and taking control of your mind. Now, let's get to this next clip, because in this third clip, Joe makes an incredible observation, and it leads us right into an amazing discussion about self. And if you want to understand better about how your mind works, listen to this clip, and we'll discuss how that happens after that.
Let me stop you there,
Sure.
because we're getting deep into the weeds here. What do you say to someone who is happy with what they do, lives a fulfilled life, exercises, and is still depressed.
Yes, I thought a lot about this. Remind me to come back to the thing about East London.
I know this is an issue with a lot of people. I know people that worship at the altar of science and modern medicine that firmly believe that all depression is because of some sort of chemical imbalance in the brain, and anything that debates that or anything that disputes that notion pisses them off.
Okay, so a few points here. One, the reason that people get pissed off when you start to challenge the fact that depression may not be a chemical imbalance issue is because they take that chemical imbalance idea and they create a portion of their sense of self with it, that this is the truth, this is my world, this is a part of me, it's a chemical imbalance, and when you attack that, you're attacking me. Now let's talk about how this whole sense of self thing works in your mind, because it creates 100% of your emotional reactions that you will have from the moment you take your first breath to the moment that you take your last breath. Let's get into that. So your brain is your basic organ of survival, right? Your brain is designed to help you survive from one day into the next. It is designed to, memory is designed to help you remember where the food and water is. Cognition helps you figure out how to build shelter and how to figure out how to communicate with others to be able to hunt. Your sense of humor, in fact, is even a way of being able to coax people into bed to propagate the species, right? And the limbic system, as we spoke about previously, is that thing in our minds, in our brains, that scans for threats constantly. And it's the thing that's always going, is this important? Is this important? Is this a threat? Is this a threat? And it's always throwing things up in front of us. Is that thing that when you see the garden hose laying against the house or near the house, you're like, is that a snake? Right? That's your limbic system asking if that thing that is coming into your senses is a threat, makes you jump. Okay, so the problem with that, or the other side of that coin, is a next question must be asked. Well, a threat to what exactly? When I see a leafcutter ant over there and I wonder if it's a threat, I need to know whether or not I have leaves. I need to know whether or not I am a leaf, right? So I need to have a sense of self. And that's where your mind's sense of self comes in, right? The mind's self. The mind's self is the laundry list of stuff that your brain thinks is you, or your brain identifies is you. And that's the whole survival mechanism thing. It's a physiological requirement that your body has to say, okay, I have this whole threat to self system. Limbic system is the quickest part of the brain, right? I get much quicker getting angry than I do getting happy. It's the quickest thing that makes me jump involuntarily. It is the most fundamental, primitive portion of the brain right above the brain stem is this whole limbic system. It's the protection of self thing. Well, what is it that I have to protect? And so that's the reason for our sense of self. It's a physiological requirement that must be defined. Otherwise, we could spend all day defending against every potential threat for that comes against a list that's not us, and then we expend all our energy and we die. So that self, that concept of self, must exist, and that's why it rules absolutely every portion of our emotional processing, because everything that comes through our limbic system is checked versus that laundry list of stuff. And so if you think understanding yourself isn't important, you are wrong. Understanding your mind's self is probably the most important thing that you could do in the entirety of your lifetime, because it takes up 47% of your mind's processing during the day, period. So you can get half of your life back if you can down-regulate some of that stuff. And beyond that, it causes 100% of the emotional processing you have. So you can take control of your entire emotional landscape if you can take control of your mind's self. So understanding this for the next minute or so is going to be important to you. So listen up. Okay, so it used to be thought that your mind's self was just your body, right? And a number of studies recently disproved that, including by Jim Cohn, by Tiffany Burnett White, by Sam Harris. And Jim Cohn's UVA study was, he took a group of folks and he put them in an fMRI, and he put a pair of glasses on them with an LED flashlight in there, and then put an ankle zapper on their ankle and said, okay, I'm going to give you a flash of light, then I'm going to give you a zap. And that's the coolest job in the world. I would sit back and eat popcorn all day and just pressing that button and probably sell the video rights out to everybody. But here's the thing. He measured the brain's reaction in between the flash of light and the ankle zap. to say, okay, is there a fear in there? Is there an amount of fear? How much fear is there? What sections of the brain light up? Because that's going to identify the portions of the brain that are associated with self, right? Because it's a threat to self. And so he measured that, and this got the results that they perfectly expected, that the brain's areas that were correlated with fear and with self lit up in between the flash of light and zap. But then he took a second group and he said, okay, now we're going, then he put up a second situation with that same person. And he said, okay, so now we've got your baseline set for your fear response. We're going to bring in somebody that you don't know, and we're going to put the ankle zapper on them. So now you don't get to be zapped, but you get a warning for when they're going to be zapped. And so what they did, they gave the flashlight and the glasses, they gave a pause to measure the brain, and then they zapped somebody else, the stranger. So maybe they giggled, maybe they didn't. I would have giggled. But here's the situation. There was no fear in the brain measured in between the flash of light and the zap on the ankle. And so what that confirmed was that fear is a reaction to a threat to self, which is a universally accepted definition of fear, right? Everybody's known that since Aristotle, who defined it originally. So basically, they confirmed through fMRI, watching the brain, that fear to a threat to somebody else doesn't elicit emotional response. Well, then they did a third situation for that experiment, in that they brought in somebody familiar to the person in the fMRI, someone they loved, spouse, child, special friend, someone that was close to them, for whom they cared. And they said, okay, so we're going to give you the flash of light, we're going to measure your brain, and then we're going to zap your friend or your loved one. And so what happened? And this they didn't expect. The same exact patterns as the first time when they were zapping the person's body showed up when they were zapping the familiar, the loved one, the person whom they cared about. There was absolutely no difference. In fact, they had a huge problem telling the two scans apart from situation 1 and situation 3. And what that proved was other people can become mapped onto our sense of self. Other people become a portion of our sense of self. And that was huge because, we had a hunch about it, but we never had any scientific proof. And so after that point, we now have scientific proof that other people can be mapped onto our sense of self. And there are multiple areas of the brain that map the self, but basically they all work in conjunction with each other, sending signals back and forth. We never thought that it could expand beyond our body, but now we had proof in this initial study that we could add people to our self map. So our parents, it's now explained why we can feel emotion about the people that we love, our parents, Aunt Patty, special friend, our kids. We can have emotional reactions about threats to them, or about happy things that happen to them, or about potential losses that happen to them. We could be sad for them. We could be disappointed for them, right? That's why it's not really that we're doing that for them. It's because they're wired into our sense of self, and our simple nervous system is reacting because it's part of the laundry list of stuff that we are wired to defend. Okay? Now, let's take that a step further because it gets more interesting. A study or group of studies started by Tiffany Burnett White at UIUC showed us that we can also be attached to ideas, and specifically brand identities, including like sports teams. The whole Apple Android argument, and why people get so heated is because she showed through this study that people react in the same exact centers of the brain that are associated with self with ideas of brand and ideas of value and ideas of function. And the operative word here is ideas, right? It's ideas can get attached to sense of self. And Sam Harris showed that politics and religion play the same exact role. It's an idea that our mind gets attached to. It's an idea that becomes a portion of our sense of self, which then our nervous system uses the same exact wiring to, just as a baseball is flying toward our head to jerk out of the way, the same exact function is then used to defend politics, used to defend religion, used to defend all the knee-jerk reactions that we have to attacks of self that are associated with things that aren't associated with our body, but which we identify as ideas that are a part of us. And that explains every emotional reaction that you have in life. If you don't have a connection to something and you learn, like, some Canadian lacrosse high school team wins the championship and you're not connected with lacrosse, you're not connected with Canada, you're not connected with that Canadian high school, you could hear about it and you don't give a shit because you're not connected with it at all, right? Well, that's because it's not a portion of your sense of self. Your sense of self is connected with every bit of turmoil your mind will ever create. Let's see if there's anything else I want to show you. Oh, yeah. So all kinds of ideas can be mapped to yourself, right? Your cultural heritage, scarring memories, your life story, career, job, whatever you're doing for your job. When your job gets threatened and you're up for layoffs, that's why you get worried. It's why you get fearful. Your accomplishments in life, your PhD or whatever it is that you've got, your coworkers, everything that is connected with your world, everything that's connected with your mind's definition of you then becomes something that can throw your day off. It can rock your boat, so to speak. So the more shit you're connected to, the more complex your life is, and the more vehemently you hold on to this stuff, then the more stuff there is to ruin your day. Okay? All right. So let's stop there with the slides. But that goes back to Joe's point that when somebody attacks the idea of a chemical imbalance not being the cause of depression, when it actually may be the symptom of depression, the people who have really glommed onto that idea and made it a portion of their sense of self, well, what is that? That's an attack on their self. It's like saying you suck, right? And they're like, well, I don't want to suck. So that's why they get all upset and have a vehement reaction to the attack on self that they perceive. Whether or not it's a really attack on itself, it's not. It's just an attack on an idea. Maybe it's a right idea, maybe it's a wrong idea, but the problem is the people have made it a portion of their sense of self, which is why they defend it vehemently, which is why the Egyptian folks are defending the idea that the pyramids were built 5,000 years ago and that the Sphinx is only 5,000 years old, when, the reality is that there's rain erosion that says it's probably 22,500 years old, right? But it doesn't fit what they've attached to their sense of self, with their culture, with their discoveries, with their science. And so anything to the contrary is an attack on their self. And so they react accordingly. And so there are specific definitions of how the emotions work. You can read about it in Mind Hacking Happiness Volume 1, but basically there are patterns that are never broken in the human species of why anger arises, why sadness arises, why fear arises. And so these patterns are exactly true to the reactions that these folks are having. Okay, let's get to the next clip, because I am a fan, although I pointed out an error that Johann might have made earlier in the podcast. I am a fan of his position on depression, and he discusses why chemical imbalances may be an incorrect assumption for depression. Let's watch that now.
And this comes back to, think about how different that is, everything we're talking about, think how different our conversation has been to what my doctor told me when I was a teenager. And I go in and I say, I'm in real pain and I feel like pain is leaking out of me and I can't control it. And he says, you've just got a malfunction in your brain, right? One of the worst things about that, there are many things wrong with that. Firstly, what he said to me is not true. I'm sure he believed it. I think he was misinformed. I don't think he was deliberately lying to me. But what he said was not true. But also, to me, the biggest problem with just telling this exclusively biological story about depression and anxiety, there's some real biological factors, of course, is it cuts us off from having this conversation, right? Mm-hmm. All those people you were talking about who are so insistent, as I was, that their depression is just the result of a chemical imbalance. If you think that, it disconnects you from the source of your pain. It tells you you're just biologically broken, and presumably always going to be biologically broken. When the conversation we're having, which is a different conversation, it's a difficult conversation, it's a nuanced conversation, it's not simplistic, it's not one problem, one lever to solve it, it's a much deeper and more textured way of thinking. That is the conversation we have to have. That's what the best scientists in the world are telling us.
And I think that's completely correct, because from a scientific perspective, the official definition of depression is a sadness that lasts longer than 2 weeks. Now, there are a number of things that do happen in the body that can exacerbate that, chemical imbalance being one of those, okay? But if you want to talk about sadness in general, the rule for sadness, right, there's this thing called your equation of emotion. I explain it in my first book, Mind Hacking Happiness. But basically, the way your nervous system works is it's a big comparator. right? It never tells you the real story about something. It only tells you what's going on in relation to what it measured in the last number of moments. Like when you put your hand on the stove, it doesn't say this stove is 180 degrees, please remove the hand from the heat. It says, ow, this is much fucking hotter than it was a second ago. You need to remove your hand. It's always a comparison of one moment to the next, which is why when you wake up in the middle of the night and you smell the gas leak in your house and you're walking around smelling for it and you're trying to look for it, and then all of a sudden you don't smell it anymore. You think it was a dream and you go back to sleep and the gas kills the whole family. Well, the reason that occurs is that moment one, the gas was low, and then moment two, the gas was high. It was filling the house, and then your subconscious mind said, "Hey, wake the fuck up, asshole!" And so you get up, you start sniffing for the gas. You walk around for 10 minutes, and all of a sudden, time 2 to time 3, there is no more difference. So your nose stops reporting the gas because your entire nervous system is nothing but a big comparator. It's comparing one moment to the next, and it says, "Okay, nothing has changed." It's why we get used to smells. It's why we get used to noises. It's why we get used to pain sometimes, where we can have pain or have tension and really not even feel it until somebody points it out to us, or somebody starts getting us on a massage table and starts pressing on us, and we're like, "Ow!" Right? That's the basic function of the nervous system, to be a comparator. Well, the same is true for your emotions. It compares two things. It compares your expectation and or preference of a certain thing, and that's, take anything on your self map, by the way, an expectation or preference that your affinity for Apple products not be molested in any way, and then you have a perception. And if you read a headline, or somebody says something, or something enters a bad thought enters your perception, well, these two things now are compared. This is what the two things are. This is what the two things are that are being compared for every emotion that you have in your life. Expectation or preference about something, which is always going to be, it's got to be good. And your perception about something, which at that point, if it's good, if it's balanced, if your perception about something is good, then you have a positive emotion. If it's imbalanced, like your perception says, "Oh, well, this sucks," then you have a negative emotion. Well, sadness specifically is about experiencing a loss of something. Right? When you lose somebody from your life, you get sad. When your team takes a loss for the championship, then that's a devaluation of your team. That's a disappointment, right? Sadness comes in multiple levels. Well, sadness over 2 weeks ends in depression, and then a lot of things can occur, chemical imbalances, and your body can then keep you on that snowball effect of depression developing further, right? Because then that can become an imbalance in your chemical makeup, which makes life tough for you, right? But the original catalyst may not be the chemical imbalance in the first place, which is what Johann's talking about in his book, and I completely agree, because from a basic operation of your nervous system perspective, your chemicals just don't become imbalanced. There's always a cause. There's an intelligence up there that's creating that internal pharmacy, and if it's malfunctioning, there's a reason that it's malfunctioning, and it's not always, sure, for a minority of folks, it may be a chemical imbalance. But from my perspective of the nervous system and how it works, there's going to be a catalyst for that initial snowball rolling off the top of the mountain. There's going to be a little bit of a push somewhere that gets that snowball rolling, and then it can pick up speed, and chemical imbalance can add to it, and pills can help, like antidepressants can assist with the chemical imbalance and help you get back on track, but it's going to be the thing that you handle in your mind that's going to help your depression most, as evidenced by the results of the studies and the experiments that people are doing. Okay, so wanted to add that to the conversation. Let's get on to the fifth clip, where he discusses, ironically, how Amish people are some of the most healthy folks in America, and he mentions my hometown, so I thought I'd have to add this clip.
One of the things that was most challenging to me is this evidence that the people with the lowest levels of attention problems and depression and anxiety in the United States are the Amish, right? And I am a atheist, gay, liberal. So the idea of going and learning something from the Amish was initially challenging to me. And I've got to admit, I felt really humbled by going and spending time there. I went to this village called Elkhart-LaGrange, which is just outside Fort Wayne in Indiana.
By the way, it's pronounced Elkhart-LaGrange. Just saying.
And, there's still a lot I disagree with about the Amish, don't get me wrong, not least because I just rewatched Witness. But you know, I could see that they've got. So there's a very interesting thing about the Amish, as you know, when you turn 16, if you're an Amish, you've got to leave and go and live in what they call the English world, our world, right? And then you decide whether to come back. About 80% decide to come back, 20% don't. It's one of the reasons why the Amish is never counted as a cult, because no cult would do that, right? No cult's going to tell you to leave for 2 years and then decide whether to come back. It's in fact the exact opposite. So they have lived in our world. They know our world really well. And I remember having this very challenging conversation with, what's his name? Lauren Beachy, his name is an Amish guy there, who said, there was so revered, it goes back to the weight conversation we had. He said, look, there's loads of things I miss. He talked about missing that 70s show. He said, I used to love driving in trucks because they obviously don't drive, they don't use electricity off the grid. And he said, but you know, if I kept those things, I wouldn't spend time with my family. I wouldn't spend time with my children. I wouldn't know who my neighbours were. And he said this very challenging thing. He said, you know Weight Watchers? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, the idea of Weight Watchers is you can only lose weight together as a group, right? It helps, or not only, but it helps you to lose weight together as a group, that you would find it harder on your own. This is like that. And I said, what? So are you saying like the Amish is like Weight Watchers for the problems of Western civilization? And he's like, yeah. That's what I'm saying. And to me, that was so challenging, the idea that you've got to give, because it comes back to what we say about junk values. In our culture, we're told the solution is always to get more. And the idea that the solution is to have less and be present more is really challenging.
And he's completely correct. The Amish are cool folks to hang around with. I grew up in Elkhart, Indiana, and there's a huge Amish contingency there. Or contingent there, in that they live around that area. You sometimes have to drive around their horse and buggies on the way to wherever you're going. But they have amazing flea markets. They have amazing garage sales. They have amazing auctions because they're incredible craftsmen. They're incredible bakers. They spend a lot of their life in the fields, getting up before sun up and going to bed after sundown, working on the farm, helping each other. There's a huge sense of community there. I dated an Amish girl who was a jerk over, is what they call them, at 20% that leave. She was a jerk over a little early. She left when she was like 13 instead of when they push them out like at 16 for a couple of years. She was hot as fuck, man. And I think that might be one of the reasons that she was jerked over into regular life, quote unquote. You probably can go search for the URL hot as fuck Amish girls, and it's probably going to be available because they probably all leave because they're tainted and lured by the regular world, and because they're so attractive. Crazy girl, loved her. But here's the thing. They have a sense of self that expands beyond just their body and what their ideas are, because they don't add a whole lot of external ideas from our corporate existence, from our, civilized, well, uncivilized world, right? From our up-to-date, I mean, they don't even have electricity. They don't have cars. They use hand labor to build things, and they use hand tools to plow the fields. They don't have like these big mechanized tractors, that type of thing. They don't use any new type of technology. They find themselves much closer to God, much closer to nature when they retain that lifestyle, which is why a lot of those folks say, you know what, I'm happy with the way it is. I'm going to go experience life in this convoluted, complex, technological world, and 80% of them go back. I mean, that's not a cult saying, you got to come back. It's a, fuck, I hate that TV shit, that constant media bombardment that exists, and all the shit that comes with, this developed world thing. Let me just get out in the field and get my hands dirty and grow some food and pet the animals and yada, yada, yada. I mean, that's the real reason that a lot of those folks live that way. And I think this next clip that Joe makes a comment similar to that supports this assumption.
I don't even think it's about having less. It's about what they're doing is, look, think about what the Amish are doing. First of all, massive sense of community, right? They're very connected. They're not using cell phones. They're not using email. So the community is also based on one-to-one interaction, real social cues, real social interaction, which is critical. It's a big part of being a human being, and it's one of the more absent things in modern society. 2, physical labor. They're involved in a lot of physical labor because they don't use electricity. They don't use power tools. There's so many things that they don't do. So because of their culture, they're making their own homes, all right? So they have a vested interest in helping each other, working together as a community, and they have a deep sense of satisfaction of constructing each other's homes. You construct my home with me. I help you build your home. They take care of their animals. They take care of their crops. There's a real connection with where they get their food from, a real connection with where they live, their community, the sense of just the sense of belonging to something that's bigger than you. There's so many factors involved in their happiness that you can kind of see where, there's a lot of wacky shit with the cult aspects of being an Amish person, but what you get out of it, it's almost like if you had a self-help group that subscribed to all the positive benefits of being Amish, and they just called it like regrounding or something like that. You just go out there and you become a part of nature. And I mean, that seems like a co-op. That seems like some sort of a farm-based co-op, right?
And I think Rogan nails it right on the head with his comments. Okay, so I wanted to leave the last word with Johann Hari, because his presence on the show was amazing. He made a lot of great points. I think you should probably pick up his book that he mentions, and you should probably watch the whole episode if you want to understand a little bit deeper about some of the challenges of depression that may not be caused by simply a chemical imbalance. So I'll leave him with the last word, and I'll come back and close it up right after this next clip.
I think this is the stuff we're talking about, is the path out of stigma, because what it says, if what we're saying is there's just this class of people who are biologically different to us, and they have this flaw that you and I don't have, you can see why that leads to stigma, right? But if what you're saying is, actually, we're all vulnerable to this stuff. Actually, the things that are making some people depressed, anxious, and addicted are making loads of us just less happy than we could be, less fulfilled than we could be. What that does, instead of dividing us into two tribes, it says we're all on a continuum. And actually, the fight that will help these people who are depressed and anxious will also improve your life, right? That's, to me, a much more powerful message. Instead of the problem being an inexplicable biological malfunction, it's a response to things that you can see in your life.
And he's completely correct. If you want to understand your mind a little bit better, you can read Mind Hacking Happiness, which explains the operations of your mind soup to nuts. It's been called one of the best books on the human mind currently in print. It explains your emotions soup to nuts. And if you understand how that works and how your mind creates your emotional turmoil, then it enables your name it, tame it effect into action. And it will physically, like a sneeze, you can't stop it from happening, turn your negative shit down. And that same negative shit is the catalyst that winds up dumping people into depression. So check that out. You can get a free copy from Audible at mindhackinghappiness.com/audible. I hope this message finds you well. We'll discuss some other stuff later. Talk to you soon. Peace.